So, here we go. Um, yeah, inductive arguments probability. We're about to get started with that, but I wanted to stimulate that disposition, that critical disposition, right? So I'm gonna hopefully entertain you or get that critical disposition going again with an example from the media this week. As you might have noticed, there is not a lack of controversy around Donald Trump, especially in this presidential race. And one of the things that came to light this week, because there are multiple outrages to pick from, if you will, is, the following. So Donald Trump decided to, hire his own Justice Department to defend him in court in a defamation suit. A defamation suit basically meaning that he said something about somebody else and that somebody else thought that was improper and even a lie. So that was challenged in court. And the Justice Department, represented here by Philip Barr, argued that this is a normal application of the law. So using the Justice Department for defending the president in these matters is a normal application of the law. Mr. Barr said during a news conference in Chicago. The law is clear, it's done frequently. And he added, the court said that elected officials in a representative democracy, when they are answering questions in office, even about personal affairs, any defamation claim is subject. So any defamation claim to the president falls under that law. So you could hire the Justice Department or get the Justice Department to defend you. Basically use taxpayer money to defend yourself against such claims. All right, so what's interesting here is not necessarily whether it's a deductively valid argument or not, but you could reconstruct it as a deductively valid argument. And what's going to be interesting, not necessarily the validity or lack thereof, but the fact that because you're using your critical thinking glasses, you're able to deconstruct and recognize all parts of the argument. So you're better able to pin down what precisely you agree with or not, or what precisely agreeing with its argument would entail. So that goes beyond that primary hunch, right? For, this is nonsense, or this is weird, you shouldn't use taxpayer money. No, we're going to precisely pin down what is happening here. So if we reconstruct it as following, if elected officials run into lawsuits as a consequence of acts that fall within the scope of their official duties, they should be defended in court using taxpayer money. Basically, this is me rephrasing what Philip Barr said in the previous slide. So if you're an elected official like the president and you do something in your duties as a president that should be defended in court, you can use taxpayer money. Trump ran into a lawsuit during X. So X falls within the scope of Trump's official duties as a president. Therefore, Trump should be defended in court using taxpayer money. That's a good argument, right? That's a proper argument. You could agree that, yes, if all three premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. So that we could call this valid. And the interesting thing is, when we're going to look at, what it actually means. So perhaps you're now curious as to what Trump actually did. So what is X in this argument? Now we know that it's part of a valid argument. Let's look at what he actually did. So what he did was deny, in not too subtle terms, that he had sexually assaulted or actually raped Jean Carroll, who was quoted, who said in an interview that she had an encounter with Donald Trump in the 90s where he assaulted her in a short encounter. And Trump responded to that in a publication, The Hill, by saying, I'll say it with great respect. Number one, she's not my type. Number two, it never happened. It never happened, okay. He said, seated behind a resolute desk in the Oval Office. That's where the president sits of the United States. And he added, she's totally lying. I don't know anything about her, he said. I know nothing about this woman. I know nothing about her, etc., etc., etc. All right, so he denied something, and she's saying he's lying. And he didn't just deny it, right? He didn't just say, it never happened, end of the story. He said, no, she's not my type. Right? So, if we go back to that argument, if we are going back to wondering what that X is, that duty, what would supposedly fall within the duty of an acting president, is not only whether the president should defend himself in defamation suits. That seems like a reasonable thing to expect, but should we view it as reasonable to say that commenting on the appearance of somebody who accuses you of sexual assault falls within the task of the President of the United States? And that's where the controversy starts. It's not necessarily that Philip Barr says that the president should be defended by a legal team that consists of lawyers paid by taxpayer money. It's that to get to that conclusion, you would have to conclude that commenting on the appearance of women is part of the tasks of the President of the United States. All right, so I hope this helps stimulating that critical disposition, right? It's not up to me to force any conclusions up on you, but you could wonder whether indeed this should be part of the task of a president. And you could wonder whether, if we go down this road with these types of legal arguments, what are we willing to accept from a president? What can he do, and what falls within or without the scopes of his official duty? All right, so that shows you, hopefully, that being able to break down stuff you're reading or stuff you encounter in real life or in the media in this case, you're able to break that down in its component parts, and you're able to zoom in on one of those components and look at what the implications are of accepting that, in this case, X, commenting on the appearance of women, falls within the scope of his official duties as a president. And you're better able to understand where the outrage in this case, or the controversy, arises. All right, that was just another attempt of me getting you to develop that critical disposition, or train that critical disposition, or keep it busy if you've already developed such a disposition. Which is, again, the first step in this 5 steps we're taking this month, right? You need to develop a disposition, you need to learn to recognize arguments, you need to learn to reconstruct arguments, and then we're at the steps of logical and factual assessment. All right, today we're going to focus again on that 4th step, logical assessment, but we're not going to look at deductive validity, we're going to look at inductive force. We're going to talk about what that is. What is inductive force? We're going to talk about what type of inductive inferences you might learn to recognize, and what are, tricks, if you will, for assessing inductive inferences, different types of inductive inferences. And we're going to look at the role of probability in inductive arguments. I'm going to build on what you already know and understand about probability, and we're going to apply that to assessing inductive arguments. And then we're going to focus on 1 or 2 tools that might make that assessment of inductive force more intuitive, hopefully. Like we did in the Tuesday lecture, we used decision trees, right? So we're going to do something similar, only now to gauge or assess what probabilities apply in a specific argument. All right. Right, so you remember that we started talking about falsification on Tuesday, right? I said, what is the logic behind the falsification principle? And you all had excellent intuitions on that. And we ended the lecture by saying, the idea behind falsification is that you can't really confirm your predicted observations and conclude anything in logical terms about your theory being true or not, because then you would be confirming the consequent in your argument, which isn't valid. And then we applied that to an example of researchers talking about frogs, right? And you had the frog, an advertisement with a frog part in it and without it. And they looked at the differences between the two, and they said, if the frog is there, you see a stronger activity in the left hemisphere. You see a stronger case of left hemispheric dominance, which is a general measure, broad measure of EEG activity, differential EEG activity. And we looked at whether, if you look at that argument by the authors as a deductive argument, would it hold or would it be deductively valid? And we've seen that no, that wouldn't be deductively valid, because that would precisely be what Popper warned us about. We would then be saying, if my theory holds, then these observations would occur. these observations have occurred, so my theory must be true. So we're confirming that consequent. We're trying to verify our predictions instead of falsifying them, which has no logical implications. But perhaps you're thinking, we shouldn't be too strict. Perhaps a deductively valid argument wasn't implied, which it isn't in a lot of cases. Mostly we're dealing with uncertainty science, right? So scientists aren't to say, well, this is necessarily true because I know this to be true, right? They're saying, well, probably this is the case because I think I showed that this is the case. So shouldn't we look at the frogs and the bouncing ball advertisement and that argument as an inductive argument? Shouldn't we say that what we're probably saying is that, well, if somebody experiences positive emotions, then probably it's this form of brain activity is taking place, left lateral dominance. I see that this case of brain activity is taking place, so therefore people probably must experience positive emotion. Isn't that, well, a more charitable way of looking at the argument? It is, but does that make the argument forceful as well? And it isn't. And for better understanding why it isn't, we need to talk about inductive force, what it means and how we can assess it, and then we'll get back to this example. All right. By the way, there is one thing I still, in relationship to that critical disposition, right? You should always be critical, even of what I'm saying in a lecture, and especially of these type of graphs. And you can forget this immediately after I said it. But interesting thing here is that they note that something is significant by using this asterisk. All right. And if you look at the description of the asterisk, it indicates that there's a p-value of lower than 0.05 indicates that there's a difference from baseline. That's weird, right? That's something, again, that you should be on the lookout for, even if it's a scientific publication. Because what the authors are concluding has to do about a difference between the with and without frog condition. What they're given in this graph, or indicating with the asterisk, is whether the difference between the mean activation that they found here compared to a baseline activation, presumably of 0, is significant. To conclude that there is a significant difference between these two, that we would lead to a meaningful conclusion about frogs and the bouncing balls in the advertisement, you would have to compare these two. That's not what they're doing in this picture. They're comparing this one with the baseline and noting it's significant. Right, so you need to be critical about it. It's significant, but what exactly is significant? And is that relevant for this conclusion? But again, forget it. This is just for the critical disposition. What we're going to look at, what the goal would be for today is checking, making sure we're able to assess the whether this is inductively forceful, this argument, as you might encounter it in scientific publications. All right, therefore we need to talk about inductive force. So an example would be, this is an inductive argument, P2. If this is an inductive argument, then it's probably Friday. Conclusion, it's Friday. This is a forceful argument because if you assume the premises 1 and 2 to be true, the conclusion is more likely to be true than not, because premise 2 indicates that, well, yeah, it's probably Friday given all the rest that precedes this proposition. So yeah, probably it's Friday. It's more likely to be Friday than not, given that the premises are true. Shorsa has a question about whether the term probably gives away that it's forceful. In most cases it does, but that's not necessarily the case. So probably the use of the term probably usually is a signal for that an inductive argument is intended. And it could be the case that that's an inductively forceful argument, but it also has to do with the amount of times that the term probably returns in different premises. But we're going to return to that point in a while. And the question of Kylan is excellent as well, and we'll return to that in a bit as well. All right. Another example, most students drink tomato juice on Friday mornings. X is a student, so X drinks tomato juice on Friday mornings. It's not necessarily true if we assume that P1 and P2 are true, but it is more likely to be true than not, given that the premises are true. So again, we're doing that critical thinkers 2-step, right? That dance, the 1-2 step, and the first step being we first do the logical assessment. So we first look at the actual connections between the premises and the conclusion before we look at the actual truth value of the premises and the conclusion. We first look at whether the premises, if they were true, have any bearing on the conclusion being true or not. Are they connected in a proper way? A proper way being a case of a valid argument, or what we're doing right now, a case of a forceful argument. So we're still looking at the connections between arguments and not the truth value of the premises itself. It's just the first step in the critical thinkers 2-step. All right. To stress that point, really bring it home, here's another ridiculous example. The most ridiculous example I could think of this morning. Most banana are gentlemen. Mrs. Peanut Butter is a banana, so therefore Mrs. Peanut Butter is a gentleman. This would be a forceful argument, right? Because you know that most of the bananas are gentlemen. Not all of them, so we're not certain about the conclusion, but most are. So therefore, this example of a banana is probably also a gentleman. I'm showing you this ridiculous example because you would probably say that most of these propositions are untrue, right? So that's why I listed the F behind them, saying, well, yeah, all of this is probably false. Even though if we assume the premises to be true, the conclusion would probably or more likely be true than not. That's why we call it forceful. And similarly, Bob says Heidi ho. If Bob says Heidi ho, then I'm probably listening to a lecture. I'm listening to a lecture. So in this case, the fact that you're listening to a lecture is true, even though, and the argument is indeed forceful, because if the premises were true, it's more likely to be true that you're listening to a lecture or not. And then we have an example of an argument that contains a conclusion that's actually true and two premises that are actually false, but still we call the argument forceful because it's not about the propositions being true or not. It's about checking whether if the propositions were true, would the conclusion then be more likely to be true than not. All right. So if we look back to our different steps that we're taking in assessing arguments, right? So if you remember on the first level, we first take that first step of the critical thinkers 2-step. We try to assess the connection between the premises and the conclusion. And the first question is, must the conclusion be true if the premises are true? And we've looked at that step in detail on Tuesday. And if the answer is no to that question, you're first going to check whether the conclusion is more likely to be true than not if the premises were true. So it's a similar question, but it's more a question of degree. And we first need to answer that before we can get to actually checking the truth value of the premises. All right. So let's look at an example again to get that feeling for what we mean by inductive force. Usually a lot of examples help, a couple of simple examples. So Patrick Swayze was a good dancer. Most good dancers have had dance lessons. So Patrick Swayze has had dance lessons. Would be an inductively forceful argument because, again, the conclusion is more likely to be true than not if premise 1 and 2 hold. What we mean by most and what we mean by probably is what is explained at length in the book as well, is that we use a very minimal interpretation. So if we say something probably is the case, what we're basically saying is that the odds are more than 50% that it is the case. But we don't specify how high is percentage, how likely that is. In the same manner, if we say most x's are y, we mean that more than half x's are y. We don't say whether that's 80 out of 100 or 99 out of 100, but we assume this as a lowest threshold, right? If somebody says most or probably, we assume that they're talking about more than 50% of cases. Sometimes, but not in a lot of cases, people actually specify a percentage they want to they do make that percentage more specific. So if you say Patrick Swayze was a good dancer, 90% of all good dancers have had dance lessons. Patrick Swayze has had dance lessons. We would call that still a forceful argument, right? Because it's about whether that probability of the conclusion being true, given that the premises are true, is indeed higher than 50%. That's what we mean when we say, is the conclusion more likely to be true than not? Is the probability of the conclusion being true higher than 50% given the premises? If we look at the final example, Patrick Swayze was a good dancer. 30% of all good dancers have had dance lessons. Patrick Swayze has had dance lessons. You would have to call that not forceful, because that probability is lower, right? So what we check when checking inductive force is whether the conclusion is more likely to be true than not. If you had to specify that in a percentage, we take a very low threshold and we say, by saying it's more likely than not, it's at least 50%. So if it's above that threshold, as in the second example, you say it's forceful. If it's below that threshold, you say it's not forceful. All right. So that should be clear, what we mean by inductive force. There is a slight complication, and I don't really want to spend a lot of time talking about it to you, but the book does spend a lot of time about it on it, and I think the book makes a mistake here as well, so we need to be clear on that. So if I would ask you to assess this argument, and the question then is, if I ask you to assess an argument, I'm always asking you to take these steps in this order. So you start with this step, and is the conclusion necessarily true if the premises were true? If no, then you move on to the second step. If no, you stop. If yes, then you can check whether the premises are true. So if you apply those steps to this argument, if I toss a coin, the probability of heads is 0.5. I toss a coin, the probability of heads is 0.5. How would you assess that argument? A lot of people are saying it's valid. I would agree with that. Somebody says it's valid and sound as well. Yeah, assuming that the coin is fair, you could say it's sound as well. So if you move to the second argument, if I toss a coin, I'll probably throw heads. I toss a coin, I'll probably throw heads. Would you say that's valid or forceful or neither? My sound is off. That's interesting. So somebody's speaking, you can hear them, but I can't. That's the point. Okay. Let me check. That's weird. Should be able to hear you, but perhaps. Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay. I don't know how many questions I've ignored so far, but I should be able to hear you now. So, we'll get to the questions that you might have raised already. I'm sorry, my sound was going to my headphones, which I'm, as you can see, not wearing, instead of to my speakers. But it's going to my speakers now. The second example is valid as well. So I'll just finish my thoughts here and then I'll get back to your questions. The second example is valid as well because the word probably is part of the conclusion. And that's a bit weird. And that might raise some, so it's weird because in the book, sometimes they use examples in which they put probably in the conclusion, but they don't mean it to be part of the actual conclusion. They just mean it as an indicator word that an inductive inference is meant, right? So that it probably such and such is the case, then usually the book means, well, the word probably is just an indication that what follows is probably true, but the word probably is not part of the conclusion. So, but later in the book, they're making the point I'm making now, that if probably is part of the conclusion, then, and it returns once in the premises as well, then you have a valid argument. So that's an answer to Shor's at the beginning. Is the word probably also always a signal that it's a forceful argument? Well, no. In these exceptions, you could call it valid. But it raises a lot of confusion because the book is not very consistent in applying this rule. So for now, you can take it from me that in the examples we're using and in the questions you might get during an exam or weekly assignment, I won't put probably in the conclusion. I always just put in the conclusion as I've done so far, right? So I had a couple of examples. Mrs. Peanut Butter is a gentleman. I'm listening to a lecture. Somebody drinks tomato juice. It's Friday. I never put in the word probably there. So I'm always expect that's reasonable, right? Because of these two steps. I always expect you to first check for deductive validity, and if it isn't valid, then I expect you to check for inductive force. So it doesn't really matter whether I indicate whether I was intended an inductive or deductive inference, because as a charitable critical thinker, you're going to check for both. Right? So don't be confused by the word probably in the conclusion, even though the book is a bit trying to confuse you, or not trying to confuse you, but that might have been a result. I will make things easier for you to avoid these type of situations. So of course, I might ask you whether a specific probability is indeed deductively the logical consequence of the premises, but I'm not going to say give you a conclusion of which probably is part of to confuse you, right? So I just wanted to point it out. I saw there were a couple of questions about it.